Hello, and welcome to the last of our 2024 Lunch and Learns. Our presenter today is Rick Mitchell, Historic Preservation Planner at Mead and Hunt. Rick has over 30 years of experience in preservation and cultural resources management, including over 2 decades as a historian for the Texas Department of Transportation and the Texas Historical Commission, where he worked on Depression-era and historic road and bridge inventories. Today, Rick will be sharing the history of the Chapman family and their innovative agricultural enterprises in both Texas and Oklahoma. Take it away, Rick.
Great. Thanks for the nice introduction, Shay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to make this a full screen for me. There we go. Well, today I'm going to present on, as Shay said, the Chapman Ranch. It was something that I originally presented on in 2023 at a Transportation Research Board meeting in Oklahoma City. And that presentation focused on the Chapman Ranch, which is a large-scale agricultural landscape in South Texas. It was just kind of a simple road improvement project that really revealed some interesting resources, in this case, the agricultural landscape, and brought along some questions and some challenges with it. So along the way of looking at the Chapman Ranch, my coworker, Alex Borger, and we began to learn more about the Chapman family and their ties not only to Texas, but also to Oklahoma. We found that the Chapman Ranch had a parallel farm development in southern Oklahoma called Washita Farm. So I began to delve more deeply into the Chapman's contributions to agriculture in both states. It's a pretty interesting story, and it's something that I think add significance to the properties and the landscapes that they're associated with. So in this presentation, we'll start out looking at our Chapman Ranch project in South Texas, and then we'll follow it up with some discussion of the Chapman's Washita Farm and its contributions, and then we'll look a little bit at the similarities between the two properties. So this is on Chapman Ranch, and this is a project that we at Mead and Hunt worked on in conjunction with the Texas Department of Transportation, or TxDOT. So this shows the existing state highway that runs through the ranch. It's a rural two-lane road. The project itself was going to be very basic, just widening those shoulders a little bit, adding a passing lane here and there, and adding some turn bays at a couple of different intersections. And here's a map of where the project's location, or where the project's located. It's near Corpus Christi in South Texas on the Texas Gulf Coast. The project is about 25 miles long in a rural area, but it's a great cut through for traffic going to and from Corpus Christi up there at the right and over to US 77 I-69 to the lower left there. So we thought it would be a really simple project, and so did TxDOT, I'm sure, but the road passes through what's known as the Chapman Ranch, and that's kind of what made it interesting from a cultural resources standpoint. The region around Corpus Christi is known as the Texas Coastal Bend. This area, along with Point South, were dominated by very large cattle ranches through the 1800s. But by the 1910s, shifts in agricultural markets combined with advancements in farm mechanization and transportation and irrigation led to conversion of many large ranches in the area to farming, generating more income through the land subdivision and greater ag income per acre. So the area's flat topography and the size of the land holdings often led to very large acreage farms, typically devoted to cotton cultivation. So those conditions set the stage for the development of the Chapman Ranch. In 1919, Henrietta King of the King Ranch sold much of the Laurelest division of the King Ranch, which is the area along the Nueces and Kleberg County line, northward towards Corpus Christi, to Philip A. Chapman, who was known as Alex Chapman, who's a successful farmer and oil investor from Waxahachie, a city just south of Dallas in north central Texas. So one thing I guess that we wondered was, how did this farmer in a non-oil producing area become an oil investor? And it's really a key to understanding kind of the family's future enterprises and what they did. So Alex Chapman's son, Jim Chapman, moved to Holdenville, Oklahoma in 1901 to help his uncle, Robert McFarland, with his ranch and farm operations. So the two men ended up discovering oil near Holdenville, and then they became major players in both the Glenpool and the Cushing oil fields. So that was in the aughts and into the teens. But they ended up selling their initial oil interests in 1916 for what's in today's dollars about $1 billion. For many years, it was the largest single petroleum-related transaction. And then they founded a new oil company, which also was very lucrative, which they later sold in about 1930, I believe. So Jim Chapman's father, Alex, the patriarch, held up to 25% of the stock in the oil interests as well. So the entire Chapman family really had substantial wealth by the late teens. So Alex Chapman and his son, another of his sons, John O. Chapman, wanted to use their family's oil wealth that they just found to develop large agricultural operations. So they first started with a 2,000-acre development south of Dallas in the Waxahachie area, kind of where the family had been based. They started expanding, purchasing land in southern Oklahoma in the Tishomingo and Ardmore areas, more to follow on that. And then they finally capped it off with purchasing that parcel from the King Ranch, which was 34,631 acres. So the Chapmans initially named their new enterprise Santa Cruz Ranch. You can see a map of it here. And they named it after a small settlement on the otherwise uninhabited ranch land. And they also used the name Nueces Farms to describe their enterprise. So they cleared most of the cattle pasture and scrub land. They laid out roads and drainage ditches in a grid pattern that you see here. And they divided the land into square mile, 640 acre, and 160 acre tracts for tenant farmers. So for each farm tract, the Chapmans built kind of uniform farmsteads. Each farmstead had a modest house for the tenant, a garage, a barn, and one or more worker houses. The farmsteads were usually clustered near road intersections, and the company dug a well at each intersection to provide water that would be piped into each property. So this is an aerial from an early aerial image, and it shows kind of that pattern that was repeated throughout the development. So the company, the ranch itself, as well as individual tenant farmers, also employed migrant farm workers from South Texas and Mexico. And that worker housing usually consisted of multifamily dwellings or smaller single dwellings that were located near the tenant houses. So here are photos of two former tenant houses that were taken a couple of years ago during our survey. All those houses, they're very similar in form and style. They're usually one story in height, usually a hip roof line. Some later examples had gable roofs with exposed rafter ends. There's kind of a square or a rectangular exterior plan, and they usually have this half-width inset porch that you see here, and not really much in the way of an architectural style, maybe just some limited craftsman influences. And that uniform house design was intended to foster kind of a sense of equality among the tenants, while that overall arrangement of the farmstead buildings and structures was designed to maximize efficiency. So their overall intent and kind of their stated intent for their agricultural operations there at Chapman Ranch was to encourage model practices in a way that could benefit tenants, and even in some cases, the seasonal workers, as well as the Chapmans as the landowners. So it really was an arrangement that was much less exploitative than what was typical in many places at the time. So here's an image of a farmstead from that initial period of development, and you can kind of see there's the house and garage, and then farther out the barn and a worker house, all in that linear arrangement along the road that we saw earlier. And there's another farmstead just barely visible at the far right of the photo. So here's a highway map from the late 1930s, and it specifically calls out the Chapman Ranch development. And you can see that pattern of tenant farmsteads spaced along the local county roads. And there was an area in the west part of the development, and that's where it's kind of blocked out and just says Chapman Ranch. That was actually reserved by the Chapman family for their own use in raising cattle. And the map also shows kind of the bolded line going north to south is State Highway 286 extending south from Corpus Christi to the Chapman Ranch. So you started to have state highways extend into the area. And there's a small circle there at the base of that bold line. And that's actually where the Chapman Ranch town site was located. So in addition to the tenant farms and the cattle operations, John Chapman also laid out a small town site, and he constructed company-owned buildings. A few dozen houses were constructed for ranch employees, and you see a couple of examples there, and you can see kind of the layout of the community to the left. There were 2 churches, a cotton gin, and a large 2-story warehouse. There were 2 identical and adjacent schools. One was for white students and one was for Hispanic students. And then the centerpiece of the community was the ranch headquarters building. It was really the hub of the Chapman Ranch community and actually even beyond that Chapman Ranch, but also for surrounding areas. It's a 36,000 square foot concrete frame building. They also called it the commissary, and it housed the Chapman Ranch administrative offices, but it also housed all sorts of associated enterprises. It was the location for the local post office, service station, small auto and tractor dealership called the Chapman Motor Company, a grocery and dry goods store, a hardware store, cafe, repair shops, barber shop, blacksmith shop, with extra area towards the rear used as storage for building construction materials for both the Chapmans and for the tenant farmers. So the tenant farmers were paid by the company in a mix of cash and scrip, which could be redeemed at all the businesses at the headquarters building. So going back to that map, TxDOT asked Mead and Hunt to help clarify the evaluation of the Chapman Ranch and determine its eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. So our first big question that we had, it revolved around what was and what is exactly the Chapman Ranch when it comes to evaluating for National Register eligibility, because that term was really used to mean different areas in local conversations, but also in local or in cultural resources reports and in environmental documents. So we looked at several different meanings, I guess, or applications of the term Chapman Ranch. This shows the various ways that we looked into. So the one thing is the Chapman Ranch, that full 34,631 acre business that operated from the early 1920s on into the 1950s. There was the town site, the kind of little round area, the map inset that we looked at that was immediately surrounding the headquarters. There's the headquarters building itself. Many people just call that the ranch. It was the office and the headquarters, so a single building. Then there was also just what people called the Chapman Ranch community. And that wasn't necessarily a geographic area. It was just people who lived in that area, tenant farmers and others who lived in the area during the period of significance. And then, and also then just this large area, many people still refer to Chapman Ranch to refer to a much larger area than what the actual Chapman-owned agribusiness was. So we had to kind of look at all those. So we tried to figure out, looking at this map again, was it that larger Chapman Ranch in red, kind of the more ambiguous Chapman Ranch? Was it the Chapman Ranch company boundary in green? Or was it just that Chapman Ranch town site in that blue circle? So all 3 are known as the Chapman Ranch. So what we kind of figured out, in a way, it's all of the above. And we ended up looking at all 3 of those areas and evaluating all 3 of those areas for National Register eligibility. But really, it was really important for our thought process to figure out and get some clarity in what we were talking about so that we could have correct terminology in our reports and have accurate and appropriate evaluation. Then we looked at the National Park Service's National Register Bulletin 30, or the Rural Historic Landscape Bulletin. And that provides 11 defining characteristics of a rural historic landscape. And I won't go through, read all the list, but they're shown here in the bullets. So we looked at those, but oftentimes using that bulletin, you soon realize that the landscapes don't neatly fit into those characteristics, or it's not very easy to assess significance within that framework. But in this case, the job was pretty easy. It was quite clear that the Chapman Ranch clearly possessed nearly all of the 11 distinctive landscape characteristics. So that was our easy part. We found that the Chapman Ranch is significant as a rural historic landscape, and this is looking at that 34,631 acre area. Significant as a rural historic landscape under National Register Criterion A, which is historical significance, for in the areas of agriculture and community development, and also National Register Criterion B for its association with the Chapmans, specifically Alex Chapman and John O. Chapman. And we set the period of significance from 1919, when the family first bought the land, to 1953, which is when John Chapman Sr. Died, and there started to be pretty substantial changes in farm practices and land ownership, and a fairly rapid decline in the activities at that Chapman Ranch town site. So that was our easy part. The next real question we had was to try to figure out how to assess integrity. So we drove up and down the state highways and the county roads, and just from driving around, there was a sense that the Chapman Ranch probably didn't retain integrity, but it was really difficult to pin it down and say why and document that, because this was kind of the view we saw everywhere. You saw the buildings in places, but oftentimes it was just a generalized kind of rural row crop landscape. It was still just a huge landscape and in agricultural use throughout. So we were really wondering how to approach that. So we used a mix of our field survey information that we had gathered, our photographs, our field notes, and then used GIS analysis to better tease out those integrity considerations. So while the overall land use still remains rural and the circulation of road pattern still follows that gridiron pattern that was originally laid out back in the early 1920s, there have really been dramatic changes to the built environment and the landscape characteristics of the Chapman Ranch. So during its period of significance, the ranch was defined primarily by those tenant farms that were between 160 and 640 acres that were owned by the Chapman Ranch operation, but then operated by tenants and by the Chapman family's cattle operation. But we found that by the 1950s, that owner-tenant relationship had assumed a more typical pattern. And at the same time, the tenant reliance on that centralized Chapman Ranch with its headquarters building and using the shared machinery and processing facilities of the Chapmans, that really quickly declined, and that accelerated from the 1950s onward. And that pretty dramatically impacted historic spatial relationships and circulation patterns and the agricultural and community activities. So today, there are a lot fewer individuals who are actually involved in active farm operations there. Much of the former Chapman Ranch land is now farmed by lessees who may not even live in this area. They may just come in to farm a parcel. So they may live elsewhere in an area. And with those kind of changes to ownership and tenancy and practices, that's really drastically changed what's going on in that area. So in this case, the slide you see here is overlaying the 1930s county highway map that shows buildings. And then we compared that to today's conditions, and that revealed that most buildings are no longer present. Here's a 1938 aerial image that we also use to check against current conditions. And that's the historic boundary of the ranch that we outlined there. Finally, this was another really useful tool. This was a map of parcel ownership and tenancy using county tax records. And that really showed very dramatic changes in ownership and operation today when compared with the historic period. So these are some photographs from a couple of years ago. So many of the tenant farm complexes that do remain, they have large non-historic age outbuildings such as machine sheds. Since farm implements after World War II tended to be much larger and continue to be larger implements and machinery. And in many cases, the house and the outbuildings on a former tenant farm tract are separated into a smaller property parcel that's separate from the surrounding fields. So there are different owners for each parcel. So one person or one family may own a house and an outbuilding, but the surrounding field is owned and operated by another entity. So using all this information, we looked to see if the Chapman Ranch retained historic integrity using the 7 aspects of integrity defined in the National Register criteria. And so looking at all the changes and alterations that we just looked at, integrity of design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association were no longer present. And so we found that the Chapman Ranch, as a 34,000 plus acre rural historic landscape, was not eligible for the National Register. But we also looked at other areas too. We also evaluated the Chapman Ranch town site separately from the Chapman Ranch as a whole. And the town site has suffered a huge number of removals. Really, at this point, it's essentially a ghost town. Most houses have been removed. There's only 2 or 3 that are still occupied. The original cotton gin was replaced about 1960. The one we saw in the previous photo was the one that was constructed in the 1960s. And most of the warehouses have been removed, just a few remaining. The schools closed in the 1970s, and they're obviously still there, but they're abandoned and they're in deteriorating condition. So I should note also that after 1953, John Chapman Sr., his son, John Jr., continued to live in Corpus Christi, and he was active in the family's remaining Chapman Ranch interests until his death in 2008. So this is a great place to visit and take photographs and things like that. While we were doing our field survey, there were several other visitors who were taking photos of the building and looking at the historical marker and things like that. But really, from a National Register perspective, it no longer retains integrity. And then, as you see here, we also looked at just specifically the headquarters building itself. And that's now vacant. There was a post office that operated there until just a few years ago. And we used a more typical evaluation pattern for that. We just looked at the building and then its alterations. And the alterations you can see in these photos, there have been many of the windows and bays have been enclosed, and it's not in great condition, but it does remain intact and retains integrity. And ironically, it was just a narrow strip of right-of-way that they were going to take from that grassy patch in the right photo at right. It was just a narrow strip of right-of-way that actually triggered the overall concern with that whole 34,000 plus acres. And so we looked at that, and the headquarters building was also determined eligible for the National Register under criteria A and B. But it turns out with just that narrow right-of-way acquisition that the project was found to have no adverse effect to the headquarters building. All right, so that was our Texas project from a couple of years ago. But as we did that, as I said, we learned more and more. And my curiosity about the Chapman's parallel enterprise in southern Oklahoma was really piqued. So those similarities, we heard that there were a lot of similarities between the two, and that interested me. And then also the fact that there was this oil-rich family whose hearts were still very closely tied to the land, and they were starting these model agricultural enterprises around. And so that was just fascinating. So as I learned, another one of Alex and Roxana Chapman's sons, Fred Chapman, had traveled to Tulsa in 1913 to work for his brother Jim, the one who had originally discovered the oil in Oklahoma. And so in Fred's journeys, he was really drawn to the rich lands along the Washita River. And he started buying land in Carter and Johnston and Murray County areas in the mid-teens, and also brought in his father, his brother John, and other family members in purchasing land in the area for farms and ranches. So Alex, the patriarch, Alex Chapman, and his son John, the same as the John at Chapman Ranch, they purchased several thousand acres in the Washita bottomlands, south and southeast of Tishomingo. in the late teens and early 1920s. And so Fred, he may have had some involvement with Washita Farms, certainly, but he had concentrated more on managing and working several other ranches and farms that he had purchased more in the Ardmore area. So here's kind of a close-up. So with this land, the Chapmans and their on-site managers created Washita Farm. And I should note that I'm talking about the Chapmans, but they also hired very capable professional managers at both Chapman Ranch and at Washita Farms. And they were usually college educated at places like Texas A&M or what was then Oklahoma A&M to run their various farm and ranch operations. So, and sorry, this has some markups on the map that were drawn in the original map copy, but this is a 1936 highway map that shows the concentration of buildings at Washita Farm, kind of right at the peak of the farm's operation. So like Chapman Ranch, there were tenant farmsteads that were fairly evenly spaced along a pattern of roads with a central headquarters complex that formed a hub within the community. So this map shows a lot of farmhouses, and it shows as you get towards the middle, there's schools and a general store and headquarters and agricultural storage and processing facilities. And then there's also, I don't know if you can see this, but there is a straight dashed line that goes north to south in the middle of the image. And that actually shows Big Sandy Creek. So early on, when the land was purchased, that creek meandered and was very prone to flooding. And so the farm's owners, the Chapmans and their managers, purchased a drag line and began to dredge and rechannelize the creek into what was called the canal, which drastically reduced the flood risk. And it also allowed them to use some of the creek's water flow to irrigate the adjacent fields. So all in all, the Chapmans constructed or improved about 20 miles of roads at Washita Farm, and they built several bridges and dug about 20 miles of drainage ditches to improve the drainage for the fields. So Washita Farm soon became well known for its operations, won prizes at livestock shows both in Oklahoma and in surrounding states, and it hosted tours for out-of-town agriculturalists and professors from universities and things like that. So here are a couple of newspaper clippings that I really think speak volumes as to how Washita Farm was regarded by others. So on the left, it's hard to read. So it's a 1920s clipping about visitors from Kansas, and it's not super easy to read the print. So I'll just kind of read off of that. It says that they, meaning the visitors, were much impressed with the fine farms and splendid improvements being made south of Tishomingo. At this time, numerous fine modern houses are being erected by the Chapman interests. Some of the finest stock in the state are to be found on their farms, where the agriculture returns prove the fertility and systematic farming methods used by the great concern. And then on the right is part of a tribute that followed the death of Alex Chapman in 1924. It's from the first part of it is actually taken from the Ardmorite newspaper. It says, the Chapmans in this country have very heavy investments in farms and ranches. They build good homes for their tenants. They purchase good livestock. They build roads, improve farms, and take care of the people in their employ in a very generous manner. And they are doing a class of work that needs to be done more than any other one thing in southern Oklahoma. It also says the farm is one of the biggest undertakings in this part of the country, and it means much to Tishomingo and Johnston County. So definitely very important. And in the middle is an early advertisement of Washita Farms, and kind of just highlights their livestock and their poultry operations, as well as their feed crops. And it's kind of typical at the bottom. You don't see a Chapman name at the bottom or anywhere on this page. It was their manager, Joe Culberson, who was the first manager at Washita Farms. And the Chapmans were famous for directing any publicity and accolades to others rather than themselves. In fact, Jim Chapman in Tulsa, who was really one of the greatest philanthropists in Oklahoma during the period, he ordered that any funds or grants that were provided to charities would remain anonymous until his death. That was part of the grants were made, or the funding was made contingent upon that. All right, so getting back to Washita Farm itself. So the tenants and the farm managers lived in very similar uniform houses. So all told, there were 48 5-room rectangular plan bungalows, about 1650 square feet, made of concrete, that was really touted as providing insulation during hot summers and also keeping warm during cold winters. And they were also very favorably touted as being rot-proof and termite-proof. And the houses actually had concrete flat roofs, but then a separate wood frame hip roof was constructed above that for drainage and also to give tenants additional storage space in the attic. So some houses were built for managers near the headquarters building, and some houses, particularly those, had garages also built of concrete. And many tenants also kept chicken house or other ag outbuildings near their houses. And each house was provided with a well or a cistern. Here's just another photo just showing a family outside their house. So a little bit about the agricultural operations. The tenants each tenant received 80 acres to farm, but they could request additional acreage from the farm management. And then they operated on a thirds and fourths basis, meaning that if they had grains or hay crops, they would receive 2/3 of the money that came from marketing those crops. And then they would receive 3/4 of the money from cotton crops. Usually there wasn't a wide mix that was suggested by the farm management, but then tenants could choose within that. But usually there was a mix of corn, hay crops like alfalfa or clover, oats and other small grains, some potatoes, and then usually every family had a produce garden as well. Something that Washita Farm was really noted for were these concrete silos that you see here. There were 14 concrete silos, and they were usually corn or other feed crops that were used for the livestock operations. So they had some dairy cattle, but they were really known for their pig operation. They usually had several thousand Duroc hogs. In 1 year, they actually marketed 1,000 hogs for market. I should also note that there were also day workers at the Washita Farm in addition to the tenants. And so they would help with farm work, but they would also help operations at the farm where the centralized livestock and processing and storage operations. Washita Farm also had a nationally known poultry program. They had up to 50,000 chickens and turkeys. The hatchery here operated 24 hours a day, 24/7. And then there were additional buildings that were used to house the young chicks and then more typical chicken houses for the hens or the fryers. And every day, something that I read into was something I thought was interesting. The farm's turkeys were let out every morning and they were herded to fields, and they would eat insects all day, and then they would bring them back into the turkey house every day as it got towards dusk. So Washita Farm was known for its cooperative programs with tenants who raised hogs and tended chickens. So for the hog business, each tenant was actually considered a partner in the farm's hog business. And then for chickens, the farm itself would supply any tenants who were interested with hens, 400 to 500 hens each. And they would also receive chicken feed and oil to provide heat and light in the chicken houses during wintertime. And tenants received new hens on a yearly basis. So the tenants were just responsible for raising the chickens, collecting the eggs, cleaning them, putting them in crates supplied by the farm. And then every day, a farm employee would come and pick up the eggs. The tenants could keep as many as they needed for their own home use. And then the tenants would receive 20% of the profit from the sale of the eggs. And just as at Chapman Ranch, Washita Farm had a large headquarters and general store building. And this image here shows the building under construction. Something else that was interesting was many of the early tenants were German or Czech Catholics. So the Chapmans worked with the Diocese of Oklahoma to start a parish there at the farm. And the farm built the church and also one of the concrete houses for the priest. And there was also a union church with Sunday school. And one thing to really note, and this is both for Chapman Ranch and Washita Farm, is that the Chapmans were very strongly interested in providing better educational opportunities for their tenants and in rural areas in general. So when they purchased the land, there were already 3 small rural schools in the immediate area when it began. And the farm helped to fund staffing and improvements to those schools. But eventually those 3 schools combined to form the Washita Farm School District. And in 1930, a new brick school was constructed in the community center. And unlike most rural schools, this school was actually went through all the way through 12th grade and was fully accredited. And many students ended up going to the nearby Murray State College in Tishomingo. So here's Washita Farm today, or just one view of it. In 1943, the farm was largely inundated by the construction of Denison Dam and the impoundment of Lake Texoma in the early 1940s. And so the full property was sold by the Chapmans to the U.S. government and was abandoned by the tenants. And now it forms part of the Tishomingo National Wildlife Refuge. I believe 40 of the 48 bungalows were covered by the lake and actually are great fishing spots, from what I understand. And here are just some pictures that I took earlier this year at Washita Farm with the remaining buildings. Here's one of the houses and a garage. Some houses not in great condition. This is one where you can actually see the concrete flat roof. Here's the old farm headquarters building. It was used for many years up until just recently as the Wildlife Refuge's headquarters as well. So there have been alterations to the building as you see at the left. Here's an image to the left of the concrete silos and the hog and chicken operations, I believe, some of the remaining buildings there. And then to the right is the chicken hatchery, which we saw earlier. Here is the frame shell of the chicken hatchery. So we can look at some of the similarities between the two, and it really is pretty amazing. I mean, here's to the upper left is Washita Farm, and the lower right is Chapman Ranch house. Both very similar in terms of form and porch and just overall kind of circulation of how that house is laid out, probably on the interior as well as the exterior. Just really the only difference is the fact that one is wood frame and one is concrete frame in many ways. This was pretty amazing when I realized this. The Washita Farm School is no longer present. There's a stone wall around the old school grounds, but the school is not there. But finding a historic picture at the OHS really, you can see the almost exact similarity between the Chapman Ranch schools and the Washita Farm School. And of course, the headquarters buildings for both, very similar in form and appearance. So I thought I'd end with this slide. This shows a couple who were actually originally tenants at Washita Farm. And when the farm was taken by the government for Lake Texoma, they actually moved to South Texas. They wanted to remain as Chapman tenants. And so they moved to Chapman Ranch. And you can see that typical Chapman Ranch tenant house form behind them. So there really was, in this case, a sense of loyalty to the Chapman family, but especially it's very clear that both locations had a lot of loyalty to the communities that grew up at these locations. And both Washita Farm and Chapman Farm were regionally important for agricultural reasons. They stressed integrated and scientific techniques. They emphasized better conditions for tenants, as well as the more typical, just general profit motive that was present in tenant and sharecropping arrangements during that time. And in doing all this, I really found that the Chapman family has a great history. I don't personally know any Chapmans, but just to hear about some of the family's continuing work. J.A. Chapman in Tulsa, he ended up focusing much of his energy and time into the gargantuan Chapman Barnard Ranch in Osage County. and that was more than 70,000 acres, I believe, used for cattle ranching. And that's now the Nature Conservancy's Tallgrass Preserve. And then Fred Chapman's descendants still operate large and prominent ranches in the Ardmore area. And again, I don't know anyone personally there, but I will say that just from all indications, they're well managed and look like really good land stewards. And then the Chapman family, through like the trusts and the foundations from the earlier generations, are really important donors throughout the decades for education, medical research, and other local and regional charities. So anyways, with that, thank you for the opportunity to present. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Rick, for agreeing to present for us today. This is Linda Ozan, and I'm the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. So I'm going to read through some of the questions that have been posed, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to get through them because there's quite a few. So the first one, the Washita house compared to the Chapman house. The Washita house had 2 chimneys. Was it a duplex?
No, I believe that those were just single. I don't know why. I noticed that they did have the 2 chimneys on the long end, on the long roof, on the long roof crest. But I believe that those were just single bungalows. It was pretty large for a tenant house also, 16. I got the dimensions and tried to multiply it out, and it got, like I said, 1,650 feet almost. And that's just amazing for a tenant farmhouse.
Absolutely. So at the time when the ranches were in use, did any one person or agency study the Chapman's properties to promote their ranching practices?
I don't know if there was one person, but certainly both locations were really well known. In both instances, there were very frequent newspaper articles of visitors. I'm thinking of the Chapman Ranch. The families have been involved in local and state agriculture work. Even at the early stages, there would be visitors, or a soil conservation society would come visit, or Texas A&M or Oklahoma A&M researchers would come to look to see what was going on at the Washita Farm or at the Chapman Ranch. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Another question. The Washita Farm had mostly concrete. Why was that material selected over that of wood frame?
That's a great question, and that's not one that I know of. And I just kind of did more informal research for Washita Farm, just kind of for fun. So I'm not sure why that would have been. Certainly, wood might have been more plentiful in southern Oklahoma rather than South Texas, and also in both locations, both at Chapman Ranch and in Corpus Christi, and then also for the Washita Farm in Tishomingo. The Chapmans actually created a lumber company in both locations as they cleared land, they would actually use the lumber or use the timber and harvest it into components for things like doors, window frames, things like that. But for whatever reason, they used that concrete. The only thing I can think is it was a fairly flood-prone area, and it might have been very prone to, like they said, rot and termites being right there in the Washita bottomlands.
Okay. So someone else posted, I believe I have seen a book that identified and described the various resident families on the Washita Farms. Have you seen such a book?
Yes, that's correct. There was a book. I don't have it with me, and I actually was able to use that as a great source as I went up to Tishomingo. So there is one that's kind of there's not anything that's a parallel for Chapman Ranch in Texas that's like that, but Washita Farm does have a great book that has a bunch of images and family histories and things like that, and that's available. That may be available at the OHS, but certainly it's available through the regional library system in Ardmore and Tishomingo.
And that leads me to a couple other questions that I'll just tie together. So where did you find the historic maps you used in both Texas and Oklahoma? And where are the Chapman Ranch historic records stored, and can anyone get access to them?
All right. Well, the maps is probably an easier or a better, more satisfying answer. So the maps are the county highway maps were available in both states. They were just available through online sources. through actually the Oklahoma highway map. You can either get through Oklahoma State, or you can also get that through the ODOT website as well. So that's where we use that. For the Chapman Ranch, there are also county highway maps from the 1930s that are available through the Texas State Library and Archives website. And then the aerial photographs that we used were a mix of publicly accessible images that are you can get from the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, Earth Explorer site, and also from the TNRIS, or Texas Natural Resource Information Service, maybe, but TNRIS in Austin.
Okay.
And what was the other question?
Where the Chapman Ranch records?
Oh, yeah, there really are no great records on that. That was really a challenge. I mean, we really relied on a lot of newspaper research, and there had been a couple of oral histories done for the ranch that gave us a good idea of what was actually going on there. But there definitely are not as complete records for the Chapman Ranch as there are for Washita Farm.
Okay. Do you know of any other examples of large tenant farms in the region that might have been contemporaneous with the Chapman Ranch or the Washita Farm?
Yeah, that is interesting, because there are other large farm operations that preceded or were going on probably at the same time. I don't know if they were on the same scale as either one, but certainly even before, say, for the Chapman Ranch, there were large ranches that were being subdivided into farmland north and northwest of Corpus Christi. I guess not due north, or you'd be in the water, but northwest and west of Corpus Christi as well. And those typically were just more either company towns, like owned by the company and operated by the company with wage workers, or were operated under a more standard kind of tenant owner relationship without the communal activities that were associated with Chapman Ranch and Washita Farm.
Is the Washita Ranch, I assume they mean farm, on the register, or has it even been evaluated?
That is a good question. So it has been evaluated in the sense that it's been taken into account, and the buildings have been documented to some extent in various U.S. Fish and Wildlife surveys for the Tishomingo National Wildlife Refuge. So that has occurred in their planning. They certainly know about that and have developed some historic context for that. But there is no formal designation at Washita Farm right now. And for Chapman Ranch, those have been determined, either eligible or not eligible. There have been evaluations done for the National Register, but there are no designations other than just a historical subject marker at the site.
And the last question that's posted today: did the Chapmans purchase their holdings in whole, or did they accumulate numerous smaller parcels over time?
That's a good question. There may have been, smaller parcels at a time, but when it comes to the Chapman Ranch, that was just one gigantic purchase. And they may have tweaked that a little bit by purchasing or selling a little bits of land on the periphery. But that was a single purchase of a huge amount of land from the King Ranch. So that's kind of where that was. When it comes to Washita Farm, those may have been, I know that those were actually purchased from several different landowners. So those were in little bits and pieces, and I think those were added on to, but it was within a relatively small amount of time. I mean, it wasn't over a 15-year period or anything like that. It was within just a period of months or a couple of years that they started to acquire that. And then, like I said, there were other Chapman family members who were buying other ranches and farms in the area as well. So you actually had other Chapman-owned agricultural operations at any given time.
Okay. Well, that ends my section since I was in charge of the questions. So Shay, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. The Chapman Ranches here, the portions that are here in Oklahoma now, are recipients of our Oklahoma Centennial Farm and Ranch Award. And so I can tell you that definitely portions of that were bought in little pieces here and there based on their application. But we hope everyone enjoyed our final Lunch and Learn presentation today on Chapman Ranches. It was a great presentation, Rick. We really appreciate it.
Sure.
Be certain to keep watching Facebook and checking out our calendar of events to see next year's lineup of Lunch and Learns and webinars. And in November, our office will be presenting 3 workshops about some of our programs. You can visit our website for more information. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.